Okay, good evening, everyone. I did see a few of you did try to sign on last Wednesday night. I did tell you we weren't going to have class then, but I appreciate the loyalty of my followers on Wednesday evenings. It would have been very difficult to try and broadcast where I was. The hotel system was not very good. So it's a good thing we didn't even try. And before we get into tonight, I want to just briefly review this coming Torah portion. There are two things that are coming about. We will be reading, excuse me. Okay. We are continuing after last week's interruption in the story with the story of the golden calf, back to the creating of the Mishkan, the tabernacle. And interestingly enough, and importantly, the Torah portion, before it gets into the major subject at hand, it in the translation here from the JPS, Moses then convoked the whole Israelite community and said to them, "These are the things the Lord has commanded you to do." So one would expect right after that we would hear about what they're supposed to be making in terms of the Mishkan, the tabernacle. But instead, what does he say? On 6 days may work be done, but on the seventh day you shall have a Sabbath, a complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. You shall kindle no fire throughout your settlements on the Sabbath day. So we start off, before we get into the details of the construction of the Mishkan and who's commanded to do what and all of that, a reminder that Shabbat takes precedence. Even over building the tabernacle, we have that elsewhere in discussing the tabernacle. It interrupts to say again the idea of the Shabbat, that the Sabbath exempts or overrules the construction of the temple, the construction of the tabernacle. Indeed, the tradition is that when a person hires someone who's not Jewish to build, say, a house for them, or a synagogue, for example, they're supposed to make arrangements that construction will not take place on the Sabbath or holidays. So no one would think that somebody Jewish should order the construction of that building on the Sabbath day. And that relates to this. However, we do know that a number of things were done in the temple that otherwise could not be done on Shabbat. For example, the ritual sacrifice still took place. And even though we're told, Lo tavaresh b'chol moshvotechem b'yom Shabbat, you shall not kindle a fire throughout your settlements on the Sabbath day, they indeed had to put wood on the altar and burn the sacrificial parts of the animal. And similarly, whatever was needed to do for the Shabbat or the Yom Tov for that holiday observance was done in the temple. And that, of course, is tied in, if you remember, when we talked about the laws of Shabbat, and that the rabbis derived the laws of the Sabbath, the 39 malachot, the 39 categories of labor, work that's not allowed to do on Shabbat, based upon what was necessary in constructing the tabernacle. And one that, and many of them are not clearly spelled out, but one of them right away, not kindling a fire, is right here front and center in this parsha. And then from then on, we go on the appointment of Bezalel as the master craftsman, and what they made, and all of those aspects of it, building the altar, and everything necessary for the tabernacle. Excuse me. Okay. All right. Now, I sent out a notice this morning that we're going to do the life cycle. I usually do this in 2 sessions, but it took a little longer for the rabbinic literature than I expected, than I usually do. And we had to miss a week. So we will pick up on less than 22, which is supposed to have been done last week, Ben Adam Lechave, 2 weeks ago, Ben Adam Lechaveiro, Jewish ethics. We will get to that later on. I'll reschedule that. And so today we are going to try and get through everything from birth through marriage and divorce in tonight's session. Okay. First, I want to note that every culture has rituals for those important moments of life, milestones of life, birth, marriage, death. Those three areas are universally observed, even by people who aren't religious. They do something in some way. So it's not surprising that the Torah prescribes and the rabbis elaborate on the various things that are to take place at the various milestones of life. So we'll start with the birth of a child, because that is the introduction to life, and that is obviously the introduction to Jewish life. We know that, first of all, we have to be cognizant that in the ancient world, life expectancy for children was very, low. Many children died very early in life. And so one interesting factor is that to a certain extent, a child is not really considered to be viable until 30 days after birth. We'll come back to that when I talk about the Pidyon Haben, the redemption of the firstborn. But when a child is born, we welcome that child. There are different rituals for boys and for girls. One can never ignore the fact that traditionally in Judaism, we had different distinctions for gender, sex. To be fair, certainly the birth of a son was more highlighted in Jewish culture, as in many other cultures. There's no question about that. The idea that you wanted to have a son as your firstborn was also a common denominator through many cultures, many communities throughout the world. Right? Of course, a parent loves whatever child comes first. Their firstborn is always special in their eyes, boy or girl. Certainly, the idea of being blessed with male children plays a role in Jewish traditions. So the first thing that we come across in the ritual realm is with the birth of a son, and that is on the 8th day, which means the same day as birth. We were born on a Monday morning. They were about 8 days later, means Monday morning next week. Every male child is to go through what is called in Hebrew Brit Milah. Brit Milah, or Bris Milah, if you use Ashkenazi's pronunciation, and that's why it's often called a bris, is ritual circumcision. The word Brit means covenant. Milah means circumcision. And males are normally, of course, born with a foreskin. And on the 8th day after birth, just like when we read that Abraham was commanded by God to be circumcised, he does it at the ripe old age of 99, before Isaac is conceived, actually. And so that is to take place on the 8th day. Now, since it says it has to be on the 8th day, no matter what the 8th day is, if the child is healthy, the Brit Milah takes place. So, for example, if a child is born on Shabbat, the boy is born on Shabbat, everything equal, the Brit Milah will take place on Shabbat. It overrides the Shabbat. The discussion in the Talmud is, what are you allowed to do, not allowed to do, what advanced preparations have to be done beforehand, then therefore they can't be done on Shabbat. But the idea is that if the 8th day falls on Shabbat, or the 8th day falls on a holiday, if it falls on Yom Kippur, or it falls on the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, fast days, you still are commanded to have the Brit Milah, again, assuming the health of the child. And that's very important. The law codes, and we talked about law codes last a couple weeks ago. The law codes all take note of the fact that if there's any indication that the child will not be healthy for the Brit Milah, it is postponed until the child is healthy for it. And there's some rules found in the Talmud and found in the rabbinic literature. One of them that is mentioned is if two sons died immediately following their Brit Milah, their circumcision, you don't necessarily perform a Brit Milah on the third son until you're confident that there'll be no problems. It was just perhaps a reference to the existence of hemophilia. Now, what kind of exceptions to that rule do we have? Well, one very clear exception to that rule, as I said, if the child is sick in some way, if the child is born premature, usually the doctors will say the 8th day is not going to be good for Brit Milah. If there is any other kind of condition, that then if it's a condition that is serious, you don't have the Brit Milah. Now, one of the complicating aspects of it is the Brit Milah is not a circumcision. Circumcision is what doctors do in the office or in the hospital. And it's fallen out of favor in the modern world, I know. It is a covenantal circumcision. So it is supposed to be performed by a Jewish observant individual. I said a Jewish observant individual because technically a woman can perform the Brit Milah. There's some discussion in the literature about that, but we do know that at least nobody else is capable of doing it. A woman can perform the Brit Milah. We do have today in Toronto, most of the mohalim, most of the individuals who do perform the Brit Milah are physicians. There are a few who are not doctors, but most of them, and as a result of the realities of the modern world and everything, insurance and what have you, they are mostly going to be doctors. Depending upon the doctor, depending upon the rabbi and the community you're from, there will be certain requirements. For example, I have no qualms about anybody performing the Brit Milah, provided they are observant of the mitzvot. So that while I have nothing against the Reform Mohalim, those who do it in the Reform community, since I have no reason to believe that they are observant of Shabbat on a basic level. I'm not saying they have to be like me, but they have to observe Shabbat at least more than going to the temple on Friday night. They can't do it as far as I'm concerned. If you're blessed with a male child, then you will consult with your rabbi as to whom your rabbi feels is a person who can perform the Brit Milah. In some communities, the Friday night between the birth of the son and the performance of the Brit Milah, they might have a special party at the home of the family. It's called Shalom Zachar, welcoming the newborn male. And then comes the Brit Milah itself. I don't know how many of you have witnessed the Brit Milah. I don't know how many of you witnessed it up close. Most of the people who witness the Brit Milah usually go stand in the back of the room. I'm usually up front. I did train a little bit. I never finished training to perform Brit Milah, but I'm always very careful to watch it. Now, the traditional method, and I'm not going to get too much details. Those who really want to, I suppose you can look up the literature and scientific literature, what have you, as it takes place, is essentially the foreskin, and underneath the foreskin is another membrane, a very loose membrane. I forget right now the scientific name for it. What the moel does is the moel draws the foreskin forward so that when it is cut, it will fall back just behind the corona, the crown of the male penis. And so they have to make sure that, the amount that is removed is adequate and not too much. Right? And the traditional way, I meant to do this, I forgot it. If you're interested, you can go look up various clamps and things that are used for Brit Milah if you're really interested in it. Traditionally, there was a device, which was a flat piece of metal that was cut out in the middle, had a slit in it. And sometimes there were different sizes, depending upon the nature of the child and their physical reality. And that would hold the foreskin enough, and then the moil would use the knife to sever the foreskin. Because the way it was done in those days, the membrane that was underneath generally would still remain, and then he would have to tear that back, and traditionally they tore it. It's called priya, and many moalim used to have their thumbnails were pointed, so they can grab hold of that piece of material, membrane, and tear it back. Later on, they came up with, you think a guitarist has picks for his fingers, they had picks for their thumbs for some moalim. Today, almost all moalim use a forceps, a small, tweezer-like implement, past the forceps you see in the medical things, but these are little ones, to grab hold of both the foreskin and the membrane that is underneath. And so when they do the cutting, it is all in one fell stroke. And then there was an Orthodox Dr. Moyle a number of years back, who came up with what was known as the muggen clamp. The shield that protected the head of the penis was called a muggen, a shield. And he came up with a device that had a hinge on it. So when he put it over the foreskin and closed the hinge, locked it in place, it really it wouldn't slide at all. It was a much more protective device. It held the foreskin tighter. And theoretically, actually, you leave it there and there would be almost or no bleeding whatsoever. And some of the Orthodox world accepted, some did not, because we call dam berit, the blood of the circumcision, of the covenant. And since if you leave that clamp a long time, there will be no blood. It really just closes off the blood vessels that are there. So some moalim will release it right away, so there'll still be some blood, but it will be less. Some have a little nick in it, so it doesn't completely close off all of the blood vessels that are in the penis and the foreskin. And that's the basic procedure. There's a ceremony. People gather together. In today's world, I've witnessed a lot of Milah on Zoom, but ideally they gather together, family. Someone is given the honor of bringing the baby into the room, usually the kvatran, that's in Yiddish for the one who brings it in. She hands it to the kvater, again Yiddish for the person male who's going to bring it in. He usually then gives it to the moil or to the sandik. The baby is placed on a pillow on a chair, Kisei Eliyahu, the chair of Elijah. Some synagogues have a special chair in the sanctuary or in the another part of their building that is called Kisei Eliyahu. Eliyahu visits each Brit Milah because, according to the Talmud, he doubted whether or not Israel would follow the covenant, and so as punishment, he has to go and see every Jewish child that has a Brit Milah. So, it has the same schedule that Santa Claus does on Christmas, right? There may be a lot of Britot on the same day. He has to go from one part of the world to the other. I don't know how he does it. If he has a sleigh or he has the chariot that took him up to heaven, the fiery chariot. Then the baby is handed to a sandik. The sandik is, depending upon the moil again, his job may be very symbolic, or it may be a real job, because he's the one who's supposed to hold the baby's legs straight out so that the doctor, the moil, can perform the procedure. Many moalim use some kind of either a device that the baby is put into, or they swaddle them in such a way that they really can't move, but the penis is available for the moil to perform the Brit Milah. And so all the sandik is doing is holding this baby, but he's really doing nothing. If he's a working sandik, the moil has him work. He holds the legs usually down like this, and the moil can do his job. Before he performs the Brit Milah, he asks the father, because it's actually the mitzvah's on the father. Do you want to do it? And most fathers say no. Occasionally they've said yes, and what the moil will do is he sets it all up, and the father actually does the cutting, but it's very safe the way it's done. I did not do it for my sons, and some are moiling themselves, so they've done that. But normally he appoints the moil. So the moil says the bracha al hamilah, asher kishana mitzvotav v'tzivano al hamilah, and does the cutting, and then the father says a bracha, a blessing, asher kishana mitzvotav v'tzivano lachnisa brit shel Avraham Avinu. I'm saying it in memory, but because I don't memorize right away. I can look it up for you if you want. And then following that, there is a naming ceremony. Every Jewish child is supposed to have a Jewish name. We'll talk about names in a little bit. And as in most rituals, a cup of wine is used. And usually the best bet for this ceremony is sweet wine, because one of the ways to keep the baby comfortable is they dip some cloth wadded up, and so the baby sucks the sweet wine, which is why many Jews end up drinking Manischewitz wine for some miserable reason. Pui, pui, pui. I like my wine dry. Now, there are a couple of things that I want to take note of. Many moalim today use a local anesthetic. And Emmeline, I think is called, I forget the exact name of it, something like that. And that deadens the area so that the child feels basically nothing. And the fact of the matter is, in all the baritot that I've attended, the baby usually starts crying when they take the diaper off. Before anything's been done, the baby is crying, if they're going to cry. And during the performance of the actual Brit Milah, rarely have I seen any kind of an issue. Whether the child suffers pain or not, I can't know. It seems there's some, but it doesn't seem to be really major. But this is a Jewish ritual. It's not a medical procedure. It has nothing to do with cleanliness. Certainly an adult male can keep himself physically clean if he wants to. This is the covenant of Abraham, and this has been what has been part and parcel of Jewish life from the time of Avraham Avinu, the time of Abraham. We know during the Maccabean period that the Greek authorities sought to ban circumcision. They killed the babies that were circumcised, the mothers who gave birth to the child was circumcised. And nonetheless, they went through it and suffered martyrdom for it. In today's world, where there's a lot of push against circumcision, there are some Jews who refuse to circumcise their children. Most traditional communities are opposed to the banning of Brit Milah, but they deal with it however they're going to deal with it if they don't want to perform the Brit Milah. Now, there is not really a parallel ceremony for girls. As a matter of fact, we know that there's a suggestion that when the baby is born, when a boy is born, the father says the bracha, Asher Haitiv Meitiv, who is good and does good. That was for boys. What about girls? There was, in the older literature, is nothing. But later on, the idea came in that you should say the Shechiyanu, because if you haven't seen somebody you know well for 30 days, you're supposed to say Shechiyanu when you see them again. Certainly seeing your daughter for the first time then merits a Shechiyanu. And so that's what I did for my daughter when she was born. Said the bracha. Now, for girls, the naming was not ritualized in the same way as for boys. It was part of the Brit Milah ceremony. You had the blessings for the Brit Milah. You have the father's blessing for the Brit Milah. You had a blessing that follows it, and over a cup of wine, and then the child is named, and then some wine is drunk. What we had for girls originally was very simple. The father would go to the synagogue on the first opportunity when the Torah was read. After his aliyah to the Torah, there was a special Misha Berach, a blessing that was recited for the mother and the child. And in the Misha Berach, the child was named. Today's world, a lot of people are not real thrilled with not having more of a recognition of the birth of a daughter. And there is no one form that has come to the forefront. Some have what is called a Zebed Habat, introducing the daughter to the community. That's what I did for my daughter. And we brought her to the synagogue and had a whole to-do then, and that's what we gave her, did her naming when I had an aliyah to the Torah. Those communities where men and women both have aliyah to the Torah. The mother and father may have it together, or the mother may have a separate aliyah. A lot of the synagogue, the non-Orthodox synagogues, the mother and father come to the front of the room, and they're both there with the baby, and the rabbi or whomever recites the Misha Berach for the baby naming. There may be a home ritual some have done. Again, if you're blessed with a daughter, you can talk to your rabbi about how and what you want to do. Now, when it comes to names, we see already, certainly in the earlier biblical period, in most of the biblical period, the name was the name. Abraham was Abraham. He wasn't anything else but Abraham. We do know that during the Greek period, they already began to have both secular and religious names. We hear of individuals who had a Hebrew name, and they had a Greek name that was usually related to their Hebrew name. And ideally, that's what it should be. So for example, Spinoza, to use an interesting example, he was known as Benedict Spinoza. That's because Benedict in Latin is the same as Baruch in Hebrew, blessing. So Baruch Spinoza was Benedict Spinoza. Now, some non-Jewish original names entered into the Jewish catalog of names. So, for example, Alexander became a Hebrew name. At the time of Alexander the Great, because everybody wanted to name their sons after this great king, somehow it slipped in. And their names and their name dictionaries out there in the world, and you can see what is available. Now, traditionally, there are two traditions about naming a child. The Ashkenazic tradition, Jews of Europe, European Jew, Eastern Europe, do not name children after a living relative. More superstitious fears that the angel of death, when they come looking for Abraham the elder, will end up finding Abraham the younger. Okay, and so you didn't want the angel getting mixed up. So you would not give the name to a child if that relative was still alive. Now we know that that was not the case during the times of the Mishnah, because the Nasi, the patriarch, there's a whole line in there. There's a Gamliel ben Shimon, then there was a Shimon ben Gamliel, and then a Gamliel ben Shimon. It was clear that they were being named after their grandfathers, their living grandfathers. And indeed, in the Sephardic world, that is the tradition. The firstborn son is traditionally named the same name as the paternal grandfather. Right? That's just different traditions. It's not forbidden in Ashkenazic circles per se, but there's a strong bias against doing it. Right? But theoretically, it can be done, and we know of cases in the past. Right? Then there's also the tradition is to name after a deceased relative that you cared about. So, for example, grandparents, great-grandparents, that sort of thing. Now,
sorry, Rob, I don't know if I misunderstood before, but why in the Ashkenazi community is there a bias against naming after your
after a living
grandfather?
relative, it's superstition. Really,
Oh,
that's
I
what
see.
it,
Okay.
it's really a superstition more than anything else. You don't want to
Okay,
give,
but nothing like halakhically.
well, there's a statement that says minhag kadin, or even custom can be even stronger than din, than law. So it's a very strong prejudice. I mean, if somebody comes to me and says, Rabbi, we really, really, really have to do this, I might, what am I going to do? Say, take a gun to their head and say, no, you can't. But, otherwise.
But if the grandfather's already passed away,
The
then
grandfather's
it's okay?
passed away, that's not an issue at all. That's not an issue
Okay.
at all. The issue is only when the individual you want to name after is still living. I'll give you an example. My wife and I really didn't have anybody we wanted to name our firstborn after. So we came up, we liked the name Eitan. So Eitan was his Hebrew and English name for that matter. But who is Moshe there? Oh, she got here, she's plugged in. She's on the treadmill and plugged in. I forget now, but there was a relative on her side of the family. It was Moshe had passed away. So we gave him the middle name of Moshe in honor of that relative. Okay, but they were deceased. Now, when Ari Shmuel, our youngest son, came along, well, my daughter Tamar Malka, Tamar again was just a name that we chose because we liked it. Malka was after my maternal grandmother, who was deceased. When it came to our third child, Ari, again, we picked Ari because we liked Ari. He was a lion of a beast sometimes. But Marilyn's grandfather, who had recently passed away, was Samuel, Shmuel in Hebrew. But my grandfather was also Samuel, Shmuel. So we didn't want to give him the first name of Shmuel. Turns out we could have, because my grandfather was actually Baruch Shmuel. Shmuel was his second name, but they used Sam Berman in America. You got to sound like everybody else. And Shmuel or Baruch wouldn't work. So we could have done it, but we didn't know that at the time. So that's what we did. Now, while I'm along in this kind of storytelling, when I was a rabbi in El Paso, Texas, I had a number of members of the congregation who were of Sephardic background. Okay? And so a couple were expecting, they came to me and they, before the baby's born, they knew it was a boy, I think, I'm pretty sure they did. And they said, Rabbi, in our community, our tradition is we name the firstborn son after the paternal grandfather. I said, yeah, I'm aware of that. Yeah, I'm aware of that, of course. That's a Sephardic tradition, no problems. He said, but Rabbi, we have a problem with the name. So I'm saying to myself, okay, Morris, it's not a big name these days in the world. Maybe you don't want to use Morris. Well, we'll pick another name that begins with M. No, rabbis, Morris is fine. We don't like Moshe. The guy's father's name was Moshe in Hebrew, Morris in English. They had no problem with Morris. They didn't like Moshe. I don't know. You go figure. So because I get questions, and this is, Rabbi, my aunt's name was Gertrude. Can we name our daughter Gedalia? Which is a male name, but anyway. Or, because it's got the same letter. I say, you do whatever you want. Right? If you really want to name someone after someone, you use the same name. Or if you want to have the names in Hebrew and English that are the same meaning, you pick names in Hebrew and English that have the same meaning. But that's not really done outside of most Orthodox circles. And even in Orthodox circles, that's often not done. So that Yankee Roberts, what is Yankee's English name? I forget. There's a family I knew back in Minneapolis. His Hebrew name is Yaakov, and Yankee is the Yiddish short for that. And Jay, his English name was Jay. Jacob, Jay, Yankee. And if they named him Jacob, at least that's the English form of Yaakov. That's the same name, really, just anglicized. But people do all kinds of things they say, the first letter of this person was an A. Can I use a letter name that begins with A? You do what you want. There's no rule what you have to do, but you do need to give them a name. And in Hebrew, they should have a Hebrew name. A lot of people of my grandparents' generation didn't necessarily give their children Hebrew names. They often gave them Yiddish names, which sometimes were Hebrew or sometimes they weren't. And so then what would happen was the child would go to Hebrew school and they would say, "What's your name?" And the guy would say, "Oh, my name is Yankel." And the teacher says, "That's not your name. That can't be right. Yankel really means little Yaakov, little Jacob. So your Hebrew name must be Yaakov. So we're going to call you Yaakov, Jacob." Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. People will come to me and say, "This person who has passed away, we don't really know what his Hebrew name was. His English name was this. Would his Hebrew name be this?" And I can't say yes to that because I know people who have an English name that is Hebrew. I have a nephew by marriage. His parents named him Adam in English, which is a good Hebrew name, Adam. And in Hebrew, he was Zachariah. So now he goes by Zachariah because he's come from. Right? But people do all kinds of things. Girls, boys, the same difference. Okay. So remember, when it comes to the Brit Milah is supposed to take place on the 8th day. It is a religious ceremony. It is not a medical procedure. Boys are named at that time. Girls are named usually, traditionally, when the Torah is read and or at another occasion that the family may have to celebrate their birth. Now, 30 days, I mentioned at the very beginning, I said the idea that in the ancient world, a child was regarded as being a very dangerous state until they reached 30 days. So after 30 days, there's greater likelihood that the child was going to survive. And so the Torah says that every firstborn male child who is a Peter Rechem, literally opens the womb, must be redeemed. So 30 days after birth, if the child is neither parent is either of a Kohen or Levi lineage, they have to be redeemed through what we call Pidyon Ben, the redeeming of the firstborn son. It's a very simple ceremony. You get a Kohen, and you need 5 silver coins, and basically the Kohen says to the father, "What would you rather have, the $5 or the 5 coins, the 5 shekels, or your son?" Depending on how much he's been kept awake over the last 30 days by the son crying, he makes up his mind which he'd rather have. So far they've always gone with keeping the kid. And so they perform that Pidyon Haben. It's an ancient ceremony. It's related to the ancient temple issues. It's still followed in traditional circles. Now, if that 30 days afterwards is Shabbat, we don't do it on Shabbat or Yom Tov. We push it back. Similarly, when it comes to the Brit Milah, I said when I talked about the Brit Milah, if a child is born on Saturday, on Shabbat, the Brit Milah will take place on Shabbat. What happens when the child is born just at sunset, or just at sunset or early after sunset on Saturday night? So just at sunset on Friday, here it is, Friday going into Shabbat, that narrow bridge of time. And they'll say the child was born at whatever time they look at the clock. Now that's not always when they were born, but that's when the doctor and nurse, whoever is recording it, looks at the clock and says born 12:01 a.m. on the first day of the month of January. All right? That's what they do. Well, that's not good enough. because if the child is born and the Brit Milah should take place on a weekday, for example, the Brit Milah should take place on Friday. The child was born Thursday night or Friday morning. Very clearly, the Brit Milah is to take place on Friday. It cannot be done on Thursday. It cannot be done early. If it has to be delayed, it has to be delayed till after Shabbat. So when a baby is born at that twilight period, going from the weekday into Shabbat or Yom Tov, or going out of Shabbat into Sunday, the Brit Milah will not take place on Shabbat. Okay? Because we're concerned that Shabbat may not be the real day the baby was born. And so therefore the Brit Milah will not take place on Shabbat. If a woman has a cesarean section and gives birth on Shabbat, a C-section, the Brit Milah will not take place on Shabbat because that was not the natural birth, as it were. Even if the child might have been born anyway on Shabbat, we don't do it. If the birth has been induced, there's differences of opinion. I'm of the opinion that if the birth takes place on Shabbat as a result of inducement, all right, then I question whether or not the Brit Milah can take place on Shabbat. Okay? Some of my colleagues say yes, because it's still the natural birth process. Though it gets sped up a little bit by the chemicals, the drugs that are taken. Similarly, if the firstborn child is not male, there's no Pidyon Ben, there's no Pidyon Bat tradition, although I'm sure in some circles they do it today. If the child was born by cesarean, there's no Brit Milah because it's not considered to be Pet Rechem, opening the womb. It has to go through the birth canal. Furthermore, if there was a miscarriage beyond around the 90-day mark, it's no longer considered to be Pet Rechem for Pidyon Haben. Okay? So in any of these cases, those of you who with issue, talk to your rabbi about what his or her guidance is for the Pidyon Haben.
Rabbi, I have a question. So
Sure.
If the child is born through a C-section, there wouldn't be the 30-day ceremony where you redeem them?
Correct.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not to equate them exactly, but in theory, animals also, firstborn animals were considered to be holy, and they were sacrificed on the altar. That we don't do with our kids. We buy them back. Although some days I wanted to. If an animal was born by a C-section, it was not a Pet Rechem, was not considered to be a firstborn. Or if it was clear that that animal had a miscarriage much later on in term, again, it would not have to be redeemed. There'd be no, it would not be considered to be the Bechor. Now, there's discussion in the Talmud as to how many children one is supposed to have. Now, let's go back 2,000 years ago. The mortality rate for infant mortality was extremely high. And how many kids would grow to adulthood was often very questionable. So it's a very clear prejudice in Jewish thought against having any birth control and against limiting family size. And that dates back to the ancient realities. And now we come fast forward to today's world, and there are differences of opinion on birth control, what is permitted, what is not permitted. Traditional circles, generally speaking, frown on birth control unless it's absolutely necessary for the health of the mother, her well-being, her health and well-being. And in that case, usually, and then it's, since it may not be fair, but according to rabbinic traditional understanding, the mitzvah to have children is on the father, on the man. A woman is not required to have children. Although usually speaking, I think the other, it's another way around in terms of desires. But that opens the door for a woman to be much more restrictive on what she does in terms of birth control. These are versus what a man can do for birth control. So traditionally, as long as the sexual relationship is in, quote, in the normal manner, if a woman uses a diaphragm or IUD or uses a birth control pill, those are, at least in theory, depending upon the rabbi you talk to, the circumstances, permitted. Use of a condom or snipping. I'm sorry, I'm getting old. Words slip from my mind. But anyway, severing the tubes for the man's semen so he can't go to give birth are not allowed traditionally. And so now, how many kids are supposed to have? So this is a machloket, an ancient dispute between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai says you have to have 2 sons. And Beit Hillel says you have to have 2 children, a boy and a girl. As long as you got a boy and a girl, you fulfill the basic mitzvah and go on with, whatever, you talk to your rabbi. Or you have to delay having children for whatever reason. Again, all of these. And obviously, if the mother's health is in any way threatened, that's a whole different situation than you do the guidance between your rabbi and your physician. Okay? Now, the next important stage in a child's life really is the beginning of school. Today, some families have something in Orthodox circles. When a boy reaches the age of 3, they don't cut the boy's hair until they're 3 years old. And at the age of 3, they have an aufschieren in Yiddish. They cut the hair for the first time and introduce the child to learning. Sometimes they will have letters in chocolate, or in ancient world, used to do is they have a board and they outline the letters with honey, and the child will lick the honey off of this board or this plate, and various forms of that. Mostly you find that in more Orthodox circles, certainly in Hasidic circles. In the conservative world, we don't see it very much. My sons had their hair cut earlier. All of my grandsons had their hair cut at the age of 3. So whatever that's worth. We also know that used to be a big whoop-de-doo in German and Jewry in the 12th century, 13th century, when the boy began school. Less so for girls, because different eras girls learned. They didn't learn. It varied from era to era. But today, the most important thing is when a child reaches the age of mitzvot. First of all, once a child is 5, 6 years of age, they begin to understand a little bit of the world around them, and they should certainly begin learning how to do things. You start when the child is very young with the Shema. You sing the Shema to the child when in the crib. They don't know what you're saying. They learn to say the Shema by the time they're a couple years old. You say blessings for food when you're going to eat. The child learns to say the blessings for food. All of these become natural to their life. If you raise them that way, it becomes the norm for their lifestyle. Okay? But the basic line is the onset of puberty. The Talmud understands that a man or a woman becomes an adult as far as the observance of mitzvot and are responsible to the Kadosh Baruch Hu, to God himself, for their own actions, is when they reach the age of 12 for a girl, 13 for a boy. And that's very clearly, it's defined in the Talmud really by indication of puberty. 2 pubic hairs was understood to be the sign that the child had reached the age. Obviously, you don't go around looking for that sort of thing. And so eventually it was set upon, as accepted as the age of 12 for girls, because girls do mature earlier than boys. And according to some females, they stay more mature than the males the entire lifetime. and I don't know, guys are a little bit slower. All right? So that's why the ages of 12 and 13 were set. And most non-Orthodox synagogues often delay it for the girls till closer to 13 for whatever reason. But that's when one reaches this age of mitzvah. Now you have to understand the word bar mitzvah, which is a male form. Bar is the Aramaic form of the word ben, son. Bat mitzvah, which is the Hebrew for a girl. I don't know why the Aramaic isn't used for the girl as well. Does not mean a ceremony. And it is, a rabbi cannot bar mitzvah somebody. I hear that all the time. Oh, Rabbi, remember me? You bar mitzvahed me at your synagogue. Okay, yeah, I know what you're saying, so I agree with you. Yeah, if I remember who you are, if I haven't seen you in 20 years in the synagogue, okay. But it really is celebrating a birthday. When an individual reaches that birthday on the day of their birth, 13 years after birth for boys, 12 years after birth for girls, they are automatically subject to the mitzvot. They are a bar mitzvah. They are a bat mitzvah. They don't do anything. They are Jewish adults in essence. The entire bar mitzvah rituals, being called to the Torah, chanting the Haftarah, participating in the synagogue service, all of those things are merely recognizing what has transpired, that you've celebrated a birthday. You're telling the community, yet you have achieved the age of mitzvot. So by doing something that is normally restricted to somebody who is the age of mitzvot, you demonstrate to the world that you now are subject to the mitzvot. Right? So that's what the original basic meaning of bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah is, you have come of age. I'm always asking because I never remember, how old do you have to be before you can drink in Ontario in a bar? All right, whatever it is, 20, 19, 18, I don't know. All right. How many people go to a bar and order a drink? Right? As a sign, they can now legally drink. If they didn't go to the bar and order the drink, they could still 19. Thank you, Garrett and Heather. Right? When you're 19, I don't know if any of you went to the bar or not. It's irrelevant to me. But it doesn't change anything. If you didn't go to the bar, you still can legally drink. If you never order a drink, you can still legally drink. Right? But demonstrating it in a public manner, celebrating in a public manner is a way of announcing it and making it into something special. Okay? So that's really what bar and bat mitzvah is supposed to be. Now, obviously, what has happened is that, as what was once said back in the early, I think back in even the early 50s, there's more bar and less mitzvah in the celebration. Meaning the party has come to overshadow the ritual. And it's reached such an unfortunate extent that you hear of non-Jews who want to have a bar mitzvah, not because they want to study a Torah portion or anything like that, they want to have a party. And in the minds of too many people, that is what bar and bat mitzvah is. It has nothing to do with anything beyond a birthday. It's nice. It's good to celebrate. It's nice to participate in the synagogue in a way to proclaim your coming of age. There are no dog mitzvahs, though, although I've heard of bark mitzvahs. Some may have come across that joke. But in a sense, that joke is what unfortunately has kind of happened to the whole thing. So it's really a shame, and some have said they would be happy to get rid of bar and bat mitzvah if they could, because of that. And if you're going to have a whoop-de-doo bar mitzvah with a fancy theme and all these other kinds of stuff, what are you going to do for a wedding? And so we do know, we hear of people who says, when I was in my grandfather's generation, they were bar mitzvah. They went to the synagogue on Monday morning. They put on their tefillin. They had an aliyah to the Torah. And maybe they had a shot of schnapps and some herring afterwards to celebrate. In many circles, boys and girls in some circles will be called to the Torah on a weekday morning once they've reached the age of bar and bat mitzvah. Put on tefillin, if they put on tefillin, what have you, depending upon the synagogue, the girls, boys, whatever it may be. And that is the way. And indeed, we start putting on tefillin 30 days before the bar mitzvah. For girls, it would be the equivalent if their girls are going to wear tefillin 30 days before their bat mitzvah as well. From then on, in conservative synagogues, where men are expected to wear a talit, bar mitzvah, once the boys reach the age of bar mitzvah, they wear a talit. The girls in those synagogues where girls wear the talit, you'll see both. You'll see some who will wear it after their bat mitzvah from then on. You'll see some who aren't comfortable with it. I leave that to those who do, that's their thing. Okay? Adult females in those synagogues will or will not wear a talit. It just depends, the nature of the synagogue, the community, and all of that. In the Sephardic communities, the same thing. However, in Eastern Europe, a tradition developed that a man did not wear a talit on a regular basis until he got married. Right? Once a bacher, a young man, got married, then he would wear the talit. Otherwise, he just wore the talit katan, the small talit, the tzitzis. Even during the weekday, when he put on his tefillin, he would put on tefillin with the tzitzit on. If he's called to the Torah, then he would put on a talit. If he led the service, he would put on the talit. Otherwise, he didn't wear talit. And that was perhaps a very good social way because the ladies up in the balconies could look down and see who's available for their daughters and make a shidduch, which we're coming to in a moment. Okay? But in German synagogues, and those that follow the German ritual, the boys put on a talit. So it just depends on the traditions that develop. Okay, so kashem shenichnas labrit, ken yechanes laTorah lechupa masim tovim. We say at the Brit Milah, just as the one is entered into the covenant, so should they enter into Torah. Kashem shenichnas labrit, just as they entered into the covenant, ken yechanes laTorah, they should enter the Torah, lechupa, and marriage, Masim tovim, and good deeds. So as soon as the kid's born, we're already trying to get him married. Okay? It is unquestionable that the Jewish ideal is to have a husband or a wife as a couple. The biblical account of the creation of the first human being was the idea, so a man shall leave his father and his mother and cling to his wife, and they shall be as one flesh. It's not good for a man to be alone, a person to be alone. So having a partner, having a spouse was always understood to be the ideal. The Talmud, which is mostly written from a male perspective, would say that in essence, a man is a half a man without a wife. And in Aramaic, and it also switched over into Hebrew, baita, which means house, in Aramaic means wife. And often when we find the word bait, house, mentioned in regard to something, the rabbis often interpret it to mean the spouse. Okay. And since there's mitzvahs to be fruitful and multiply, it's hard to do that by yourself. So all of these come together to create the idea of marriage, of creating a family, creating a life together. when we look at the Bible, we see that marriages were not, you didn't go to the ladies' night at the local bar and look around and see who looked like they were available for a companion, man or female, right? That was not what the Bible's, although, as I pointed out, we have a whole bunch of marriages that end up starting at a well. So I'm not sure how much different that was in some ways. Moshe finds his wife at the well. Yaakov finds his wife at the well. Eliezer finds a wife for Yitzchak at the well. So I guess the watering spot was still a good place to go looking for shidduch. But as in most of the ancient world, marriages were arranged. But when you read about the marriages in the ancient world, it's very clear that even the marriages were, if they were arranged, people tended to fall in love with each other. It's very clear. Certainly there are cases where they didn't, I know that. And famously, I was listening to a podcast on the history of Rome, and some Roman, I forget who it was, but he was laughed at behind his back because he actually loved his wife. The Romans thought that was weird. You got married because you have to get married, family alliances and all those things, money and that. To love her? I guess that's some sugar. They didn't say sugar, but But anyway, and when we read things here and there, we see there's a famous story of Rabbi Akiva and his wife, how they fall in love and they get married against her father's wishes, and how she sends him off to study and learn. And one day he decides to go back to see his wife, and somebody comes to tell her that Akiva's come home, and she says, can't be, it's too early. He still should be, he has a few more years to study at the yeshiva. And he had heard this. He hadn't come into the house yet. So instead of coming in, he turns around and goes back. I don't know if it's true or not, but that's the story. Then later on, we're told he comes after he's become this great sage, and he comes home, and there's this woman in the crowd that she's trying to get near him, and his students are pushing her away. And Rabbi Akiva says, stop. If it weren't for her, I wouldn't be here. And when Abraham buries Sarah, he says he comes to mourn her and to weep for her. Right? So we do know that by the rabbinic period, even if marriages were arranged, the couple had to agree to it. At least that was the standard. You never know what takes place otherwise, but that was the standard. Even in the biblical story about Rivka, when Abraham's servant, who we assume is Eliezer, goes to get a wife for Yitzchak, the family asks Rebecca, do you want to go? Do you want to get married to him? And she says yes. Had she said no, it would be all off. And the rabbis write in various places that a couple should not get married before they meet each other. So even today, though, especially in Orthodox circles, although, marriage is looked at a little bit differently in the way it's set up. Now, some people meet their spouse to be at work, at camp, as campers. I met my wife on a trip to Israel. We were 17 years of age. Okay, so we didn't have a shidduch or anything like that. We knew we were going to get married soon after that. Had to wait till I was 21. But in the Western world, however you find your partner, you find them. Now, in the more Orthodox circles, and today with all kinds of apps, it's a little different, right? What's the difference between looking at an app and going through, this person has this interest, that interest, that interest, that you think they might be a good match for you, and you choose them, or you go to a matchmaker, a shadchan, usually a she, and she says, well, tell me about yourself. And she's got male clients and she's got female clients. And she says, well, he's like this, she's like that. they would go together. He's like this, she's like that. Nah, it's not going to work. And they set up a date. It's fun. It's still, you don't see as much around here, but in Israel, you go to some of the major hotels, and the ground floor, they would have sitting areas, right? And you order a drink. And as my daughter said it when she spent a couple years in Israel, you would know that what's going on. On the first date, you would have a couch here, a coffee table or something, and another chair, couch over on the other side. The man's on this side and the woman is on the other side. Okay. The second date, they were sitting catty corner from each other. One's in the chair here, one's right next there, but not sitting together. Maybe by the third date, they might share the sofa with distance between them. And in some circles, that's it. Either you get married after the third date, or you go looking. I don't know how often that really happens like that. My sons took a little more than just 3 dates with their intended, but that's, well, in one case, it's actually both cases, they were kind of set up. Okay? But it's up to them. You know, nobody's holding guns to their head saying you got to marry this individual. You will hear about people being forced into it or not forced, being forced out of it. That's in everyday life. Okay. So traditionally, now, I know we're living in the 21st century. I'm born in the 20th century, so it always takes me a little while to remember it's the 21st century. So in the 21st century, the sexual mores in a large part of the world are very different from what Jewish tradition assumed. I'm going to treat you like you're all in the 19th century. I'm not insulting anybody or meaning anything by it, but we're moving back in time to what's supposed to have been the proper way of life. Right? Men and women did not mix very much together. Certainly, an unmarried couple would not be alone together in a room by themselves. Pui, 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 God forbid. Someone might think something was going on. And even out on the street, they would never hold hands. PDA, you know what PDA, public displays of affection. All right. In those days, PDA was walking close to the other person, much less holding hands or doing something more. All right. So now this is the world that Jewish tradition comes from. So in that world, men and women were often segregated. They did not have marital relations before being married, at least in theory. Certainly there was a double standard, and we know that prostitution existed. We know in Eastern Europe that there were prostitutes and there were black hats sitting on the coat hangers going into the bordello. Women were expected to be virgins. The marriage contracts still today, even though it's only pro forma, lists the status that the woman is married, unmarried, if she's been married or been divorced, or she's a widow. All of that is in the ketubah, the traditional ketubah. An unmarried woman, unmarried bride is got a higher ketubah value. She's owed more money if there's a, God forbid, a divorce. I don't deny it's double standard, and some things are retained as pro forma. All right. So anyway, so a couple decides they want to get married. So what do you have to do? Well, the basis is very simple. In the presence of 2 witnesses, 2 kosher witnesses, traditionally adult Jewish men who are Shomer Shabbat, the man gives an item of value to the woman. Today, it's normally a ring. And he says, Hare at mekudeshet li b'bat zo kedat Moshe of Israel. Behold, you're consecrated to me by this ring, according to the laws of Moses, the people of Israel. And then the man gives the ring to the woman. They are now, she's mekudeshet. They have a bond. They're not really married yet, but they are connected in a very strong manner. And this used to take place, and then sometime later, as much as a year later, would be the actual wedding ceremony. Today, we do it all together under the chuppah. Today, what happens is, again, you have to have two witnesses. Usually, you have to have a rabbi who supervises. The role of the rabbi really is just make sure everything goes right. The man gives the ring to the woman, makes that declaration. And then and they have a cup of wine. All right, so let me go over the order. All right, so this is what normally takes place. Sometime prior to the ceremony, in many circles, the man, the woman may go to the synagogue, have an aliyah to the Torah for their upcoming wedding. There's special prayer they'll be reciting. Different synagogues had it different ways. The bride goes to the mikveh as close to the wedding date as possible, and the hairdresser and all of those things all taken into consideration. All right. That's traditional. There's nothing in many circles. The man will go to the mikveh today as well before the marriage ceremony. So the day of the ceremony is there. Okay. In the bride and groom traditionally didn't see each other, or at least in the last few hundred years, didn't see each other until the ceremony itself. My son, my youngest, and my daughter-in-law, they went crazy with that. That didn't work for them very well. Right? But anyway, what happens is, now I'm going to talk about two different ways of doing it. The way most of you will probably experience it is you will get together in the rabbi's study or another room. You'll have two witnesses for the civil license if you're not civilly married already. And then there will be a ketubah. The ketubah is the traditional marriage document, which essentially contains within it the obligations that a man has to his wife. Food, clothing, shelter, conjugal rights. All right. The man promises his wife that she gets her fair share of sex. The wife is expected to reciprocate, but it's an obligation on the man. And that, of course, hails from a polygamous society originally. Now we know in the Middle Ages, they often had an extra codicil that was put into the ketubah in Sephardic lands, that if the husband wanted to take a second wife, or if he even wanted to hire a female servant, he had to get permission from his wife. And if he didn't get permission from his wife, he had to pay her an exorbitant sum of money. So keep that in mind, ladies, if you're really interested in that. But anyway, now, so the ketubah has the basic marriage requirements. In the ancient world, it also contained other kinds of information about property, because marriage really is a contractual relationship. And I think in today's world, it's become more of that as well. We think about romantic ways, but when two people come together, they have monies, they have properties, whatever it is, they have to work out between them how they're going to deal with that property. The ketubah was meant to protect the property of the wife when she entered into a marriage. And the husband had certain rights to that property. Some he had to guarantee the value of it. Some of it he had to return it as it was, or has to return it to her in whatever state it is if the marriage ends in some way. Today, there are prenuptial arrangements, right? People have all kinds of, this is no different from that. People think this is something weird, but the fact of the matter is, it's coming back in vogue in a different way. Right? Today, most of the time, the ketubah is merely ceremonial. Nobody is really paying any attention to what the document says in terms of those monetary obligations. Although in Israel, it's a different story. All right. So two witnesses sign the ketubah. The bride and groom may or may not have a place to sign on the ketubah. Traditionally, they didn't. Traditionally, it was all in Aramaic, sometimes with a translation. Sometimes there's both English and Aramaic, or Hebrew and English. Bride and groom may or may not sign. The rabbi may or may not sign. All of this, you talk to your officiant rabbi when you get married. The last step is what we call in Yiddish the bedecken. The groom places the veil over the bride. The veil was part of the ceremony. And we usually quip that, when Jacob marries Rachel and Leah, he ends up marrying Leah because he couldn't see who was in the dark. So in order to make sure you're getting the right bride, you put the veil over. Most of the veils that we have at our weddings, doesn't make much difference. But if you go to very, very Orthodox weddings, Hasidic weddings, the ladies need to be led to the chuppah because that veil is so thick you can't see anything. My nieces in Israel all went through that. Okay. If this is an Orthodox ceremony, the men and women usually are separate for these things. The groom's in one room, the bride's in another. And then after the signing of the tuvah, the groom is escorted to the bride, where he puts the veil on, and then they line up to go under the chuppah. Now, getting under the chuppah, there is no religious significance. However it is done, is done. What you will mostly see, and this is not meaning it has to be this way, but what you will mostly see is that groomsmen come in. You have groomsmen, and then or the grandparents are going to be sitting down, or older relatives, they're going to sit in front seats, whatever. They are then followed by the groom's parents. They walk halfway down the aisle, if you're having that kind of a thing. The groom walks, they escort him up under the chuppah. In an Orthodox ceremony, usually the groom then puts on a kittel, like we're doing about Yom Kippur. Then the bridesmaids and the flower girl and the bride's parents come marching down. And then the bride comes in and everybody stands up and, takes all the flash pictures and all of that. And then they escort the bride to the chuppah. Various rabbis, various things, different ways. And the groom may escort her up to the chuppah. He may not escort her to the chuppah. The bride may circle the groom 7 or 3 times. Some to make it fair and more egalitarian. The man circles the bride 3 times. She circles him 3 times, whatever. Okay. And then traditionally they line up, and the bride is to the right of the groom. Usually they have their backs to the audience. Not always, but usually. Traditionally, they were supposed to be facing east. Traditionally, this wasn't done in synagogues, by the way. It was done outside. They stand under a wedding canopy. It has some kind of canopy with to represent their future home. They're welcomed. Then the rabbi, usually is the rabbi, says a few words of welcome, takes the first Kiddush cup, says the Brei Pri Hagafen, and then what is called the blessing for the Erusim. Then he drinks the wine, and then the bride and groom drink the wine. Then he says to the groom, "Do you have a ring that belongs to you?" And the correct answer is yes. The ring must belong to the groom. As I used to tell a couple, if I'm doing a wedding, if you want to have, since it's got to be a plain band, if you want something fancier, that's fine, but not for the ceremony. If you want to borrow grandma's wedding ring, that's fine, but the groom has to buy it. Maybe $1, but he has to at least own it for the ceremony. And again, so traditionally, the bride holds out her right index finger. The groom, before he puts the ring on that finger, says the Harei Yat Mekudeshet Li. There are traditionally 2 witnesses who are there as the sole witnesses of that. They will say to the rabbi, Mekudeshet, yeah, it's okay. They also look at the ring to make sure it's worth at least a pruta, a couple of pennies. And they're Mekudeshet. Usually what happens next is the ketubah is read, and that's meant really to separate the 2 parts of the ceremony. Okay? Some rabbis read the whole ketubah, some reads part of it. Then, the way I usually do it, and a lot of my colleagues do it at this point, if the bride wants to give the groom a ring, it's not kiddushin, because we're not exchanging rings. It's not chalipin. We don't exchange rings. But she might give the groom a ring and say to him, Ani ledodi v'dodi li, I'm my beloved is mine. And then we take a second cup of wine and we recite what are called the Sheva Brachot. If there's a minyan present, we say all 7 blessings. And all of these are referencing the joy and gladness that's taking place here. So let's see, this is a traditional translation. Where is it here? So the first blessing is a blessing over wine. Bori Pregaf, you're all familiar with that. The second blessing, which again begins with Baruch Atah, praises God, all was created for God's glory. The third blessing, Baruch Atah again, who fashioned the human being. The fourth blessing, again with Baruch Atah, starts with who fashioned the human being in godly image, in the image of God's likeness, and prepared for the human being from itself an eternal structure. Blessed are you, Lord, who fashioned the human being. The fifth blessing does not start with Baruch. It says, bring intense joy and exaltation to the barren one through the gathering of her children amidst her in gladness. Blessed are you, Lord, who gladdens Zion through her children. The sixth blessing, gladden the beloved companions as you gladden your creature in the Garden of Eden from aforetime. Blessed are you, Lord, who gladdens the groom and bride. And then the last one again begins with Baruch, who created joy and gladness, groom and bride, mirth, glad song, pleasure, delight, love, fellowship, harmony, and companionship. Lord our God, let there soon be heard in the cities of Judah, in the streets of Jerusalem, the sound of joy and the sound of gladness, the voice of the groom and the voice of the bride, the sound of the groom's jubilance from their canopies and of youths from their song-filled feasts. Blessed be you, Lord, who gladdens the groom with the bride. And then again, groom and followed by the bride take a sip of wine. Traditionally at this point, now, let me step back a second. Those blessings are done in different ways. Some circles, just the rabbi, maybe just the rabbi who's officiating will say it. Some circles, the cantor, the chazan will sing it in a very nice manner. The rabbi can sing it too. Some circles, they will have different people recite the blessings. Then after that is done, glass is broken as a reminder of the destruction of the temple. And that's the end of the ceremony. Bride and groom march out. Now the meal that follows is really part of the ceremony. It's called a Sudat Mitzvah, a meal that is part of the mitzvah. And at that meal, as a part of the Birkat HaMazon, we recite the 7 wedding blessings again. And as a matter of fact, every meal that has a minyan and has at least one person who has not been there before, you can say the 7 wedding blessings as part of the Birkat HaMazon for the whole week. The Sheva Brachot are said for a week. Now, in Orthodox circles, who are follow a very stringent reading of the law, the first act of intercourse, presuming it was the first time for the woman, traditionally there, normatively there would be blood, and they did not make a distinction between that blood and the blood of a menstrual blood, and so the bride and groom separate after that and don't have relations until she observes 7 clean days and goes to the mikveh again. So there are no fancy honeymoons in Orthodox circles. Most non-Orthodox circles, the bride and groom do what they're going to do for the remainder of the time, as it may be. One thing I did leave out, after the ceremony, traditionally the bride and groom go to a room where they're alone together. Remember I said, the idea was a man and woman are never alone together until they're married. This is the first sign that they are married. They can be alone together. Some food is brought to them because there's a tradition also to fast on the day of the wedding. And so that would be the first meal they might partake of that day. You can talk to your rabbi if and when the time comes for that. All right. So
Rabbi,
yes,
Sorry, two questions. One was, is there like a particular like time of day that's particularly seen as when you should get married? Is it in the morning or
You know,
in the evening?
anytime that's convenient, really. I would say in general, just because of logistics and the way the world runs. Weddings in Jewish communities are very frequently Sunday afternoon, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. You do want to make sure it's not at sunset. You want to know which day of the week you got married on. So it should not be right when the sun is going to set, because then you got problems when is the ketubah supposed to be dated and all that kind of thing. But there are marriages during the week. The Talmud talks about getting married on a Sunday night or on a Wednesday night. That's because the Beit Din meets the next day, and if the groom found something wrong with the bride, he goes to give her a get the next morning and says, she cheated me. She wasn't a virgin last night. We don't worry about that today. Okay.
And the other question I was curious about, which I think is kind of obvious, but like, so in Orthodox weddings specifically, or more traditional weddings, so the bride and groom don't kiss after the ceremony or anything like that,
no,
like in front of
most of my ceremonies, the bride and groom kiss each other that I've been at, and they end up kissing. Everybody under the chuppah gets kissed before they go down. In an Orthodox ceremony, no, nobody kisses anybody under the chuppah. They may give hugs. The men hug the men, the women will hug the women, and at the wedding, after the wedding, when the dancing is in an Orthodox circle, the dancing is not mixed. They separate for it. I can get away with this. There's a joke. The men and women are not supposed to dance together. So a guy goes to the rabbi, says, "Rabbi, can I dance with my wife?" And the rabbi says, "No, God forbid." He says, "Rabbi, can I have sexual relations with my wife?" "Of course you can." "Can I do it in the bedroom?" "Yeah." "Can I do it in the dining room?" "Yeah." "Can I do it on the kitchen table?" "Yes." "Can I do it standing up?" "No." "Why?" "It might lead to dancing." But but you will sometimes see, even in, I use the word Orthodox, but Orthodox covers a broad band. And I've been to many Orthodox weddings where the first set of dances are separate. They might even have a mechitza, men on one side, women on the other. Then after a certain stage, especially in some communities where the rabbi goes home early, he doesn't stay around for the whole thing, the mechitza comes down and the mixed dancing begins. Okay? And then there are some it's all the way through the weddings, there's no mixed dancing. And a couple or two off to the side might dance together. But otherwise, there's no mixed dancing. Because even in Orthodox circles, you will see that there are many different kinds of people that come to the ceremony from various walks of life, things like that. I just want to touch, as for non-traditional weddings, again, it's up to for those who may be in a same-sex relationship. There are rabbis who will perform a ceremony. There are rabbis who will not perform a ceremony, depending on the rabbi and their positions on these things. And again, I know here in Toronto, you can find a rabbi who will do it if your rabbi is not one who would. Although I assume most likely the rabbi you picked out for the person who's sponsoring you would be a rabbi that would share your predilections, that area. Okay. Time is it's 9 o'clock. I'm not going to go. I was going to go all the way through the death and mourning tonight, but I wasn't. No, divorce. All right. So next week we'll pick up. Well, divorce goes more with death anyway. We'll pick up there. Well, I still say, the wedding mark, dun, 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 sounds like dun, 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 dun. Well, anyway, I couldn't get it out right now, but the death march. But yeah, I've been married over 50 years, so I guess I can joke. Same woman too. Like I hear this. I've been married 50 years. 5 wives, but it's 50 years altogether. But again, just to touch upon that, these are moments that are extremely important in somebody's life. birth ceremonies, marriage ceremonies, coming of age ceremonies, and the end of life are all things that religion seeks to help people make their way through. I know that couples, no matter what their relationship was before the marriage, it changes once they're married. That statement of marriage generally makes a difference in that relationship. It just does, for good or for bad. That's a commitment that somebody makes. Until you make that commitment to the person whom you love, it's still more of a tenuous relationship. When you make that commitment, you have made that relationship much more, much stronger, much more meaningful. And I see that. I see when people who've been together for many years decide they want to have a marriage ceremony. Yeah, they don't have to. They've been living together for 20 years or whatever, but they decide that's what they want. I'll share with you. The reason I wasn't here last week was I had the opportunity to go to the Bahamas. Rabbi, you went to the Bahamas? Yeah. Make a short story long. A number of years ago, my colleague, Rabbi Allen, and I were on a Beit Din. There was a couple. They had that was their son. I always get forgotten which one's with. Yeah, there was their son. So we witnessed the Brit Milah for conversion. She wasn't Jewish. Took the baby to the mikveh. We were the Beit Din for the mikveh. A few years later, they had a daughter and they wanted to have her converted. They flew. I don't know, whatever reason, it was easier for him to fly a Beit Din down to the Bahamas than for him to come up to Toronto again. So went to the Bahamas for that. This trip, she finally decided she was converting. She wanted to do it. She had studied and converted. And we had the wedding ceremony on the beach right after she came out of the ocean. Okay, it was very simple. There wasn't a minyan. We had a very simple ceremony. We only did the first and last of the 7 brachot because that's what you do in those circumstances. But it was important to both of them. They've been married, been together forever. How many years they've been together? And while she said, she doesn't feel any different, yet the fact of the matter is that commitment was made. So, these things, and if and when God, most of us have or will experience the loss of a loved one, and the rituals surrounding it are those that give us strength to go through it. So next week, we'll talk about the end of life ceremonies and about a divorce as well. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
Just one last one, just because I'm actually from the Bahamas, so that's why.
Providence.
So
Providence.
It piqued my interest. But was that? Yeah, I'm from Nassau, in Providence. Is that so? Do you do the Beit Din with the Chabad rabbi in Cable Beach, or is it just?
There's a Chabad rabbi there in Nassau, a wonderful gentleman, because usually they wouldn't cooperate with non-Orthodox rabbis. He was very cooperative. He did that. He's also done some really good things there. There's a very nice kosher restaurant that you pay through the nose to eat at, but that's because he did.
It just opened, right? In Bahamas.
Yeah, just opened bar at Hyatt. Wonderful. We had all our dinners there. Otherwise, we kind of scrounged around for some salad and stuff. But it was really nice, and, a nice experience. And what has happened is since they introduced that, they're getting a lot of Orthodox Jews to come. So there was somebody saw me walking, and I had a bathing suit on, but my sisters were on also, and I had a hat on. But he must think the sister come up and say, "Do you want to join us for a minyan tonight? Mincha's at such and such a time in such and such a place." And so I had minyans in the evening and mornings until I left. Because they've had a whole bunch of people coming in to celebrate, vacations and stuff. So they really picked up. He's a really nice guy. If you go back home and look at Rabbi Blooming, I think it is called, He's really working hard
Yeah.
to create a nice Jewish community there.
Well, because I know they also will order in kosher
Atlantis.
food from Miami if you.
Yeah, and Atlantis now.
No,
has
no, I
one.
mean like through the Chabad. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
they have
Atlantis
stuff.
has it now. Okay.
Atlantis apparently has for groups. I don't know about individual meals.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because when I was there in November, I just kind of had to make do.
There are
yeah,
two grocery.
this is my
Okay,
first time
call-
being home
if you
since
go
keeping kosher.
home, if you go there, call the rabbi, and he can tell you where the grocery stores are that carry kosher meats and foods. You get kosher.
Yeah, yeah,
There's two of them.
yeah. They're at the
All right,
Solomon.
we're keeping everybody here. I don't know if everybody wants to hear us talk about your hometown, which is nice and warm. I left Nassau. It was 70 degrees. I come back here and got 8 inches, 20 centimeters of snow falling, and had to shovel the next day. So what a wonderful return. Okay, everybody, have a good Shabbos. And I forgot. This week is Parsha Kitisa. You're going to have the Parsha Shekolim. We read about the shekels. Okay, so you see there's extra Torah reading this week. Okay, be well, everybody.